My job is simple: to welcome you to our fall conference of the Council of American Ambassadors here at the Cosmos Club. It's wonderful to be back in face-to-face with our ambassadorial colleagues in the Council. The last time we were able to do this face-to-face was 2 autumns ago in New York. So I am grateful that we are all able to be here together and that members are able to join us virtually who aren't able to be with us here today in person. With that, I'm going to turn I should say, I guess, one other thing quickly, and that is that our conference, of course, is focused on the evacuation of Afghanistan and its consequences. It was certainly embarrassing. Many commentators have called it a disaster, a debacle, and so forth. Certainly will reverberate in our policy and maybe in our safety for some time to come, and we'll have the opportunity today to explore that in considerable detail with an impressive array of speakers. With that, let me turn the floor over to our President Tim Chorba, who will introduce our first impressive and perennial speaker, Frank Wisner.
Thank you, Ambassador Hughes. You said that your task this morning is simple. My task, by contrast, is enjoyable, and that is to introduce our first speaker, the very distinguished Ambassador Frank Wisner. Ambassador Wisner has graced us for a number of years with at our fall conferences at the Century Club in New York, when we did everything in person. And the one regret we have today is that we can't be with him in person. He's broadcasting from New York, and we perforce from Washington. Ambassador Wisner is a graduate of Princeton University, and he went on in the State Department to be ambassador to 4 countries: Zambia, Egypt, the Philippines, and India during his extensive career. In addition to serving as ambassador in 4 very significant countries, he also served in the Department of State as Undersecretary of State for International Security Affairs, and at the Department of Defense, he served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. He also was Senior Deputy Assistant Secretary for African Affairs during a time of very intense diplomatic engagement in Southern Africa. Following his graduation from Princeton, Ambassador Wisner embarked on his career at the State Department with his first posting in Algiers immediately after it won independence from France. And thereafter, he went to Vietnam, where he spent 4 years at the apex of that very traumatic war. He also served in Tunisia and in Bangladesh, and eventually joined the President's Interagency Task Force on Indochina, serving as its deputy director for an entity responsible for evacuating and settling nearly 1 million refugees in the wake of the Vietnam conflict. Subsequently, as director of the Office of Southern African Affairs, Ambassador Wisner worked with Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to launch critical negotiations involving Zimbabwe and Namibia. And having played significant roles in those various parts of the world, he concluded his activity for the State Department as the country's special representative to Kosovo status talks in 2005, where he played a critical role in negotiating Kosovo's independence. Ambassador Wisner today is the International Affairs Advisor to the national law firm Squire Patton Boggs, is based in New York. So with that, by way of introduction to Ambassador Wisner, let me say, Frank, please begin.
Tim, good morning, and good morning to all of my friends and colleagues at the Council of American Ambassadors. It is frankly embarrassing, Tim, for you to repeat my biography in such detail, but I'm grateful to you. But it's an even greater privilege to be asked to return to the council and to open your proceedings today. And I wish you all well with the balance of your discussions. You've got a terrific agenda. I guess it's pretty commonplace to observe that we live in challenging times. Certainly, as we look at the events in Glasgow, we recognize the existential crisis the entire globe faces in the face of climate change. But I want to focus more directly on American security and political interests, which today, I'm certain you would all agree with me, are under threat worldwide. We're facing a major shift in the global order and our core assumptions in American foreign policy. Frankly, from my point of view, it's time to rethink them and to act on a reconsideration of what lies ahead. The complexity and the extent of the challenges ahead is one issue, but central to our capacity to cope as is our domestic political and economic order. And I suspect each of us would agree that we stand on the edge of serious national crisis if we as Americans do not get our collective act together. And this is a task that knows no partisan boundaries. It's an all of America project. But as we look abroad, central to our foreign policy dilemma is our conception of America's place in the world. So let me open with remarks in that regard. For the America that I knew as a child and growing up, and in the years of my service in government, and the same is true of many of you, the world of post-1945 was a world that assumed the centrality of American power and responsibility. That assumption is no longer true through natural evolution, but also through mistakes in our own statecraft, notably in Afghanistan and in Iraq. At this year's summit, the G7 summit in Cornwall, President Biden said, quote, "America is back at the table." Well, I agree with that. Indeed, hard not to agree. But what do we expect? Where at this table do we expect to sit? At the head of the table, with the capacity to lead the redesign of global priorities, or just a more likely guest at the table, one among other powers prepared to share the meal, shape the menu, respect the needs and priorities of others, including those with whom we have profound differences. In a word, how do we reach a point of shared responsibility? For to be seated as one among several at the global table, we need to seek multilateral, not unilateral solutions to the crises of today. We need to do that and reconsider very carefully American interests and our capabilities, and especially our limitations. We have strengths, but we have limitations. And that requires a readjustment of expectations. America is no longer where it was at the end of the Cold War, and we've got to think carefully about ourselves. And we have to think about the interests and cultures and points of view of others if we're to get our diplomacy right. Resetting our own place at the table is not only a presidential responsibility. It requires a consensus in our legislature, our media, our academic institutions, our public at large. And I suggest that is a transformation just as great, just as profound as occurred in the post-war period when the United States first accepted responsibilities of global citizenship. And yet, we have to form a new consensus around a new conception. I'd suggest as well that no aspect of the challenge before us is greater than our need to design a stable and sustainable strategy for Asia, and particularly a strategy to conduct managed competition with the People's Republic of China. The rise of Chinese power, as many have observed, is the greatest foreign policy we challenge, and it is the foreign policy challenge we face, and it is to that issue that I'd like to address the balance of my remarks today as I reflect with you on what lies ahead in our pivot to Asia. It's my purpose, therefore, to reflect on those challenges and ideas about them, and I will offer you 10 points without excessively taking advantage of your time. So let me begin. The first and central point is, as much as we talk about a pivot to Asia, we have to start with the understanding and memory the United States has always been an Asian power. We've fought wars in Asia, World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam. We have benefited from immigration from Asia. Our culture has been affected by Asian cultures. Our trade and investment interests have long since been dominated by an Asian orientation. So we are, and always have been, an Asian power. The pivot, second, the pivot to Asia, as it is currently named, should not mean a pivot away from commitments and responsibilities that we have in Europe, in the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa. In that sense, pivot, in my judgment, is misleading and even a dangerous expression. What we should mean by pivot is that the United States has got to right-size its commitments to reflect priorities and devote the resources that we need to respect those priorities. So number three, getting our policies on China right and put on a sustainable basis is going to continue to be at the heart of the Asia pivot, the single most challenging issue. So four, to be able to take the issue of China on, we have to understand the rise, China's rise and ambitions, which is key to shaping our response to China and to the assertions of Xi Jinping. China under Xi is undergoing, in my judgment, a breathtaking transformation on three fronts. In international fora, China is making its position felt. It is willing to use threats and pressure and economic inducements. It is determined to enforce respect, and its wolf warriors are on the prowl around the world. It will cut corners in order to achieve that position of respect. It will steal technology when that is in China's interest to do so. And we have been a direct victim of China's enhancements as a global power. But not only the United States, China's international reach and determined search for its place on the global stage has affected deeply our friends in Australia, India, Japan. They've also learned how tough China can be. And therefore, we have to start with an understanding that China's reach today is global. It's also true to observe that Xi is using China's global reach to assert Chinese nationalism with a view to bolstering his own domestic position and preparing for the upcoming party conference. And if we have any doubts about what he means about China first, ask the Hong Kong Chinese, ask Taiwan and the Uyghurs, all who have felt the whip end of Xi's lash. But Xi is doing more than that. He's also putting in place a new economic order based on a reassertion of the control and authority of the Chinese Communist Party, with the diminution of what Deng Xiaoping used to describe as a privileged position for the private sector and the rise of Chinese capitalism. Xi finally is using his party and his power in a breathtaking undertaking of a cultural revolution in the name of common prosperity, reducing the focus on Chinese individualism, enforcing collective responses in child raising, in education, in the arts. Whether all of these ambitions, international, economic, or cultural, are sustainable, only time will tell, but they are clearly where China is at today. So fifth, we have to pause for a moment, take a breath, and remember that China's policies under Xi may offend us, may challenge the United States, but China should not, let me underscore, should not be cast as a foe. Its threat to us and our values should not be exaggerated, nor should our response to China be overly militarized. China is not, in my view, and I ask all of you to join me in it, is not an existential threat, even if it has done much to vex us and others of like-minded nature around the world. Despite assertions that, quote, China's time has come and the West is in decline, I do not believe that China seeks to defeat the United States. It seeks, in reality, to reinforce its prosperity, its influence, its security, and its seat at the global high table. China's Navy today is patrolling widely, but certainly not along our West Coast. And we are wise not to confuse deterrence with offensive capability or intention. Witness the current debate over China's testing of hypersonic missiles and its expanded nuclear force. We need not exaggerate Chinese military preparedness or trap ourselves into unaffordable spending. We have to look at it calmly. Our own capacity to deter is many times over what China can deploy in a lifetime. My sixth point is that our approach to China must be primarily strategic and political and based on respect for China's place in the world. It should be our intention to pursue a multi-pronged approach to China, to confront China where that becomes necessary, to compete regularly, and occasionally to find grounds to cooperate. Confrontation comes quickly to mind, given the record of the last several years, but let me argue that confrontation needs to be heralded. Where China steps out of line, heralded and explained, and our response measured and pursued in cooperation with those of like minds in Asia and with our European friends. Competition, on the other hand, should begin at home, here in the United States, with a reinvigoration of our economy and technological base. It must include in our competition alliances with other nations of similar points of view. We should seek to build coalitions of the willing, other nations that want to join us in building global infrastructure, developing technology, participating in pandemic relief, in dealing with economic recovery as all nations in the globe emerge from this period of COVID-19. We need different allies for different purposes. Some alliances fit Europeans, some fit Asians. We need to be flexible. But most of all, we have to be careful and not find ourselves in a we-they proposition. We and our friends on one side drawing a line and China on the other. For many nations in the world won't accept a we-they outcome, and that will end up being for us a defeating proposition. I believe, and I hope many of you will as well, that the Quad is an excellent approach, but in turn, the Quad of India, Japan, Australia, and the United States must be based on a broader vision than simply facing China. It must be based on a vision of an open architectured Indo-Pacific. Former Prime Minister of Japan, Abe, put it rightly when he looked at the Indo-Pacific and the Quad and talked that our objective should be a free and open Indo-Pacific, not an architecture based on explicit defiance of China. If it's open, there's room for cooperation. And frankly, here, we've got a lot of work to do. We need to rethink. Our decision to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership was a profound strategic error. And we're going to have to find a way to get back, make America again relevant on the trade front. For there is no sustainable policy toward Asia without a strong economic and trade dimension. My eighth point comes to the much debated AUKUS. I believe that the combination of the United States, Great Britain, and Australia works. I think it's a good initiative. It shows our strategic intent, and it shows that we're prepared to operate within alliance combinations. But it is important that we keep military competition away from the architecture that we should seek more broadly in the Indo-Pacific. And that is, we have plenty of ways of signaling defense intentions to China through bilateral channels. We have defense agreements with South Korea, with Japan, with the Philippines, with Thailand, and we can strengthen our own unilateral presence in the Indo-Pacific unilaterally and carefully. But we have to throughout be careful not to militarize our presence in a way that alienates the swing states of ASEAN. My ninth point, and penultimate one, is Taiwan. And here the US-China relationship is currently being deeply tested. After all, when we go back to the time of Mao, Nixon, Zhou Enlai, and Kissinger, it really began with a recognition of the strategic significance of Taiwan. But when we sat down to normalize with China, the United States accepted Chinese sovereignty over Taiwan. We insisted at that time that if reunification is to be pursued, it should be pursued by peaceful means. And our role would be to maintain Taiwan's security with deterrent measures, not offensive measures. And our basic approach to American responsibility would remain highly ambiguous. We are in dangerous territory, frankly, ladies and gentlemen, very dangerous territory when we overemphasize our security commitments to Taiwan. I have no confidence that China intends to invade Taiwan. It's certainly not a near-term certainty. And we have no interest in provoking that kind of Chinese reaction. We do have an interest in making sure that Taiwan is able to deter Chinese military strength. And that's a perfectly sensible approach, provided that we do it quietly without excessive fanfare. And there's been too much fanfare for my taste. 10th, and finally, we have to think about that competition, while it will be our goal, managed competition will be our goal with China. That managed competition should also include cooperation. And there are many, many areas where we in China, to maintain a stable relationship, can and should cooperate on climate change, clearly a priority. North Korea, in cyber, in space, in global pandemic relief, in global economic recovery, all areas where we in China can find space in a common strategic framework. But there's where the challenge lies. And so I welcome, as I'm certain all of you do, the president's signal to engage China's leaders. And if next week is when he will meet with Xi in some form, I welcome that. That engagement, however, will not take place overnight. It won't even happen quickly. It will be influenced by domestic politics in this country where tempers are up, in China where the country is preparing for its party congress, by the progress we make as well in restoring our own strength and our alliances, and by restraint on all sides. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that these 10 points catch your fancy. I believe our future does lie in a carefully defined approach to the Indo-Pacific, but keeping our eye on other responsibilities. And as you think through the events that will be shaping our future, I hope my 10 conclusions will help you think the way forward. Many thanks to all of you.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Wisner. And while our participants gather their thoughts for questions, both here in Washington and online, let me kick it off with a question to you. In the American psyche is the concept of rugged individualism. This goes back to frontier days. To what extent do you think there is in the Chinese psyche a 2 centuries long sensitivity to the outcome of the Opium Wars and their conclusion with the unequal treaties with the West? Do you perceive that influence on a national psyche as still holding today?
Tim, that's a really important question. It goes to the heart of an observation I shared with you, that to get a China policy right, you have to be able to walk in China's shoes and understand what they think about how they see the world, whether they're led by a communist regime or any other Chinese regime. So let me give you 2 observations. First of all, there is absolutely no doubt that whatever government sits in Beijing, whether it had been a nationalist government or the communist government that won the Civil War, it would have operated in the shadow of what Chinese felt was a major national and civilizational defeat and humiliation. The Opium Wars, the loss of territorial control in the Hong Kong area, in the peninsula Shantung, in unequal treaties imposed on China, defeat in its war with Japan, the Boxer Rebellion and its outcome, all these were part of a sense of Chinese decline. And all Chinese seek to reverse that decline and place China back on a strong position at the global high table. So we are going to face that. We have to recognize it, that respect for China's past, China's history, is part of understanding what kind of policy we'll pursue. The second answer is slightly more complicated, and it's coming increasingly to light under Xi Jinping. And that is, as Deng Xiaoping put it when he turned and said that some get rich, all will get richer, is no longer the byword of the Chinese regime. There was a period of time in which China looked at the triumph of individualism in American culture as something to be emulated. But as Chinese visited this country, including advisors very close to Xi, they saw the excesses of individualism. They saw the homelessness on our streets, our economic slowdown, our failure to maintain our infrastructure, our lack of political cohesion in our institutions. And the lessons they drew, and which Xi is now putting into practice, is China does not want to go down a road of Western-style individualism, but rather a collective responsibility for Chinese society and civilization. He's given it a name, common prosperity. It means that there will be a certain leveling of economic advantage. The party will guide this common prosperity, but it's an ideological underpinning of a redefined form of Chinese communism. It's not about individualism, it's about the common responsibilities of the society. And that, I suspect, is what the China we're going to face for many years to come.
As a corollary, let me ask you one follow-up question as a corollary to following on what you just articulated. Is it the case that for the PRC government, for the Central Committee, the task of seeking and accomplishing collective responsibility and common prosperity is greatly facilitated by, again, going way back in Chinese culture, Confucian values? And I when I was in Singapore, I was constantly lectured about Confucian values by Lee Kuan Yew. Is it the case that the Chinese have unlike the U.S., where our history is one of rugged individualism, is it not the case that Chinese cultural history is almost antithetical?
Tim, I think you put your finger on the intellectual dimension of something that also has a practical dimension. And it certainly is worth Americans thinking very carefully about that intellectual dimension and understanding it if we're going to deal with it. But the practical dimension is another aspect of Chinese history. And that is, if you don't maintain strong central rule, if you don't maintain a state with some power, China's centrifugal forces take over, and China descends into one of its periodic moments of civil strife, civil war, breakdown. Chinese are used to the concept of seeking stability and accepting curtailments of individual rights and attitudes in the name of a collective sense of security. And it springs from their very, very long history. It's something hard for us to appreciate and understand, but it's embedded in the Chinese psyche. Stability over competition, individual expression, very deeply embedded in Chinese culture.
Thank you. All right, we'll start with questions here. Let's start with Ambassador Desambre, who's just returned from Thailand as our U.S. ambassador and is likely to go back to live in Hong Kong shortly.
Ambassador Wisner, thank you very much for that very interesting, very comprehensive discussion. Particularly enjoyed the introduction to substantial changes put in place by Xi Jinping. I think when observing what's going on, I like to comment that previously in China, you had socialism with Chinese characteristics. Now you have socialism with socialist characteristics. I think they're really going down that path quite substantially, and that's going to be very important in understanding. But I think on the international front and the appropriate response, I come from a slightly different perspective. Part of this is driven from my experience in the private sector as well as the public sector, where for 25 years I headed up my law firm's mergers and acquisitions practice in Asia, negotiating against the Chinese quite frequently, setting up joint ventures, doing acquisitions, doing lots of things like that. I speak Chinese fluently. I negotiated in Chinese. And in general, when I teach American companies how to negotiate with the Chinese, I need to remind them that you need to put away this mentality in the West that you need to be reasonable, because the Chinese negotiations don't come to negotiations that way. So, I mean, typical American, and it really is Americans, but also Western Europeans, if they think the right spot where negotiations should end is 5, they'll say, well, okay, maybe I'll start at 4. And the other side will start at 6, we'll end up at 10. But frequently in the Chinese negotiations, the Chinese, you start at 4, the Chinese start at 10, and then you end up at 8. So there's this feeling that there's sort of a lot of willingness to just push very hard. And I've seen this in private negotiations all the time. And so the Americans need to be prepared to be unreasonable in corporate negotiations to get to a reasonable position. I use that as an example because I'm very concerned what we're seeing internationally. And I think the best case to go back to that is the island building campaign as one of the first examples where China really pushed hard on something. And I think quite honestly expected they would get pushback, but they didn't. And they were able to build the islands in the South China Sea and then state that they weren't going to militarize them. They militarized them. Nobody did anything and kept going farther and farther. And so I'm concerned. I think all of us agree completely with all of us agree completely that all of us want to avoid war in Asia, avoid war everywhere. But as frequently is said, to avoid war, you can't just hope for peace. You need to prepare. And I think militarily, the question of what China is doing and how do we respond to it, I think probably requires a little bit more of a forward aggressive posture than perhaps you're contemplating, particularly when you see 150 sorties flown over Taiwan a few weeks ago by both bombers and fighter aircraft. And you sort of wonder, okay, well, what are they doing? And so I guess two questions for you. One, do you posit that China is pursuing regional hegemony in Asia? And if so, what, if anything, we should do about that? And then second, to your question about cooperation in the midst of competition, I found your examples interesting. Climate, Korea, global pandemic, and space. Quite honestly, those look like 4 things that they're not cooperating in at all at the moment. The pandemic, they're not allowing actual real research or real investigation of the source of the virus. Korea, they historically have been obstructionist. Climate, they didn't even show up to the climate change conference. And space, they're developing space-based weapons in a very aggressive way. So I think clearly it's good if we can cooperate on some aspects while pursuing competition. What I'm concerned about is that we don't try to give in on areas to cooperate in those areas because we think that's going to help us in the other areas, which I think is not going to be the case. So I guess your question is, do we think we really have some areas where we'll be able to successfully cooperate in? I guess with those 2 questions.
Well, you've actually, let me see if I can break it into three responses. First of all, your description of Chinese negotiating tactics are very, very accurate and instructive to all of us who are listening to you and to those who are trying to do business with China or guide policy with China. However, having said that, I'd be careful to say that once you discover where Chinese national interest lies, there are ways of finding accommodating points. And I don't think Mao and Nixon, Kissinger, and Zhou Enlai would have ever reached that point had they not had compulsions that brought them to the table and found ways to balance those compulsions. So we shouldn't just say, because China goes for 10 and we like to go for 5, we're on the wrong track. I think we have to constantly keep in mind that there is a balance. Where it fits on a numerical scale is something that only can be tested. And that takes me to your second point, which is testing means being tough, being very firm, very clear. It does not mean having to be strident. I find an excessive amount of hyperbole these days being attached that's creating a sense of anger, hysteria, which I know my own democratic society finds difficult dealing with if the sort of popular image of the person on the other side of the table boils over. Witness our views of during the Cold War, making it difficult for America to adjust with subtlety. I believe you have to be firm with China. There's no question. But where and how to be firm, and where and how to pick your fights, and where and how to judge when the threat is real. You and I may differ about your description of Chinese overflights of Taiwan. And I think the record's now pretty clear that these are more political signals than military threats to Taiwan, use of Taiwanese air defense space as opposed to flying directly over. It's a more subtle approach to the bludgeoning habits that China is quite capable of deploying. So I think when you come to a tough question like the South China Sea, then you have to figure out what are your options. And here, we've not been passive. I'm going to disagree with you. We've not just stood by and watched the Chinese destroy these island atolls and build floating Chinese bases of arguable utility if they have a military dimension, but rather the assertion starting way back in the Obama administration of freedom of navigation aggressively pursued, and pursued on an allied basis, is a very smart way to make it clear that China's pretensions to have territorial rights to the South China Sea, our willingness to build from that and strengthen our ties, our current efforts to build up the Philippine Coast Guard capabilities and bring Japan into the mix, to bring the Australians and even the Europeans into the mix, are all signals that China knows and respects. I don't think you're going to be able to stop the Chinese from destroying a reef and building a platform, but you can certainly make it clear that we're not accepting the outcome that they have unilaterally posited. So finally, that leads me to your third remark, as I understood your assertion about the ability to cooperate with China. I have to agree with you full-throatedly, wholeheartedly, that the prospects today of cooperation with China are breathtakingly small. I cited examples of what we can aspire to, not where we are. And I believe to be able to move the pendulum towards greater cooperation means we have to be able to confront and to compete. And if we don't do the two of those, then we'll not get to cooperation. And we won't get to cooperation simply by saying, as John Kerry did, let's have an agreement on climate change and remove it from the overall mix of the US-China competition. I think you have to start, and why I welcome the Biden decision to meet Xi, you have to start with an understanding, a strategic understanding. Where are we and where are they? What are our red lines? What are China's red lines? If I look over the past 10 months or so, I think I've seen the United States slowly move to defining those red lines and to expanding the participants in the drawing of those red lines. The experiment with AUKUS, with the Quad, are only partial examples of the drawing of red lines. But I want to keep the prospect of cooperation open, because without a degree of Chinese cooperation on climate change or cyber or space or pandemics, we're not going to have effective solutions to what are global problems that deal with the entire world. It'll take a while to get there, but I think we're on a better track than the sound of your question implies.
We'll get to you 1 second, Ambassador Tao, but to the point that Ambassador Wisner just made about the Chinese activities in the South China Sea, it began appropriately on a Philippine atoll named Mischief Reef, and a lot of mischief flowed from that. At the time, and I happened to have been in Singapore at the time that it occurred, and Ambassador Wisner, of course, was ambassador in the Philippines at some point, the Philippine Air Force had 4 functionally capable combat aircraft. Four. And the Chinese perceived absolutely no Filipino resistance and moved onto that atoll and constructed, as I recall, a blockhouse. And that was where it all started. It was about 26, 27 years ago, and it has metastasized since then. But Ambassador Towle, chomping at the bit, will take your question.
Frank, good to see you. Tim Towle here. My question, I love your nuanced strategic stuff. Absolutely fabulous. Our nations, if you stay around, our nation's going to be secure. And you've been doing this since 1961. But I sort of watch TV now that I'm mature, and I watched His Excellency, the President of the United States, when asked about defending Taiwan, he didn't give a scholarly or even a 2-minute response. He said, "Are you going to defend Taiwan?" He said, "Yes." That's one small little word. You care to comment on that, sir?
I'm sorry, Tim, I didn't hear the last words you said. What was the question about the president's statement on Taiwan?
Distinct.
He said yes when asked if he was going to defend Taiwan against those awful Chinese. He didn't do anything nuanced and scholarly like you always have done since 61. He said yes and then walked away.
Well, Tim, you're absolutely right. It was a serious mistake. The president misspoke, and the White House was forced into overdrive to try to correct the record. I'm not quite sure public apologies for presidential misstatements would have been the advice I would give, or probably many of you, but we certainly needed to go back to the Chinese and remind them of the core understandings about our approach to Taiwan, and that is the policy of ambiguity that's been pursued successfully. I regret what the president said. I may not have responded and pulled his remarks. It weakens our image of him, but basically we haven't changed our policy, and the Chinese know we haven't changed our policy.
Ambassador Oliver first.
Thank you, and thank you, Ambassador Wisner, for your presentation. A comment and a question. The comment is how you opened your remarks. You talked about the necessity of engaging in multilateral diplomacy. And yet, very few schools of international affairs focus on that topic. And the worst of all is the State Department itself, which does very little in multilateral diplomacy. And in fact, many Foreign Service officers will tell you it is not helpful to their careers to do multilateral diplomacy. My question involves Michael Pillsbury's book, The 100-Year Marathon on China. And it has a very different vision of China and where it's headed than you do. Could you comment on that, please?
Yes, Michael Pillsbury and my vision do differ, and I needn't elaborate it. You've heard me spell out my views. Michael, I believe, exaggerates the Chinese threat, and in the exaggeration increases the costs and the dangers to us. But that's for Michael and me to engage the next time we meet. I would look forward to the opportunity. As to the first part of your question, it's very important. The word I hope to use, and you're correct in picking it up, is we need multilateral solutions. That means finding ways to work with others to come up with useful ideas and useful paths forward. That may include using the institutions of the multilateral world, the UN, its family of collateral institutions. All of these are useful outcomes and should be used. But the core idea is that you can't start with a conclusion in Washington and then insist on its being carried out. You have to be very patient and build a consensus among the major stakeholders if you're going to make sustainable progress at a cost the United States can bear and sustain. I take, for example, I'm a distinct admirer of what we are doing in the Middle East today in arranging energy solutions for Lebanon. The country is in dire existential, indeed, condition. But we are working very, very subtly to bring molecules and electrons from Egypt through Jordan via Syria and into Lebanon, requiring all sorts of subtle understandings, with the trade institution being the World Bank. That's the French are involved. Getting a maritime boundary for Lebanon with Israel is involved. So there is an example of how the United States can use its leadership to create a multilateral structure that produces an outcome important to us, the stability of Lebanon, its survival in the troubled Middle Eastern environment.
So we'll have two more questions from the floor. We'll start with Governor Gilmore. Governor, before you begin, Jocelyn, do we have any questions coming in online? All right, then first Governor Gilmore will conclude with Ambassador Hughes.
Well, okay. Ambassador, thank you very much. I'm grateful for the elaborate presentation, and would certainly want to know whether you've written any of this down someplace, because I would like to frankly go over it. It's very elaborate. And I agree with some of this. But I guess that trying to formulate a question for you to have a discussion, I come back to two things. It seems to me that our goal needs to be to deter aggression. The Chinese are signaling that they're moving towards an aggressive stance. I worry that the Afghanistan debacle sends a signal of American withdrawal and weakness that actually encourages this. My post was in Europe at OSCE, and my experience with multilateralism is sometimes there are countries that are in the multilateral organizations that don't seek solutions, and they stymie the multilateral organizations because their national interests conflict with the overall goal of many of the other countries in the multilateral organization. So it seems to me that our goal, first of all, has to be to define what the Chinese are trying to do, what they're trying to, what their end state is that they're trying to achieve, because they seem to be very deliberate about following it. And secondly, I would like your thoughts about whether we could follow a policy of change in China. Tiananmen Square, I think, demonstrated that not all the Chinese are impervious to the modern world, and that that there may be a lot of Chinese that would actually like to be free people, and that they would like the opportunity to have democracy and capitalism. I think our experiment with China trying to bring them to capitalism has failed. And I think that the discussion that we're seeing right now in the United States is beginning to recognize that failure. And I guess my question is, what do you think is the prospects here of change in China? Let me editorialize just a moment and say that I'm pretty mad with these people. They're breaking all their agreements. They're committing crimes against humanity, against the Uyghurs, and I would largely put it they're committing crimes against humanity against all the Chinese people by their authoritarian clamping down, their social scoring cards, they're punishing their people if they step out of line. These are antithetical to the Western concept. So my question is, do you think there's any possibility of reform in China where the Communist Party could actually be moved out and that a more modern China, more civilized China could emerge?
Well, Governor, thank you. I obviously disagree with your concluding but very strongly felt view that somehow out in the future as a prospect for American policy is a change of China's regime, whether it's a different kind of Communist Party, which I can't imagine, not given its long history of brutality and dominance, or a different regime in China. I don't think that is anything that the United States can aspire to accomplish with the resources we have available and with the international setting that we've got to deal with. We can stand by our principles. We can speak strongly on all the issues that you've mentioned, of which you and I both feel very strongly about the mistreatment of people, Uyghurs or other minorities in China or Hong Kong, many of the issues you've pointed to. We can speak strongly, but to aspire to change those as an objective of American foreign policy, I just don't see the United States having either the international standing or the domestic constituency or even the resources to undertake. And the age that I foresee, Governor, is one in which the United States cuts its cloth to meet its capacity to strengthen ourselves and compete, but not by stating goals that cannot be achieved. And that I would put very high on my list. Internal change, shaping change in China, that's something that will happen in China's own time, and I'm afraid it won't be in my lifetime. So the second point that I extracted from your remarks was about the value of alliances in dealing with China. Let me be very clear. Multilateral institutions are useful when they can be turned to achieve objectives. I gave you the example of the World Bank acting as the intermediary in solving a problem in the Middle East. That's terrific. But if the World Bank wasn't prepared to step in, we would have to find another way to move forward. We're not bound by multilateral institutions. They are a tool in the service of building multilateral approaches. And if you can't get a coalition of the willing on one subject, you'll aim to get it on another. The argument core to my opening contention is that the United States has to figure out how to multilateralize its approach to the solution of problems. The third and final point was Afghanistan. And we all have strong feelings about Afghanistan. I actually believe, having lived and served in South Asia and having followed this as closely as you have, I believe that we made the right decision to call an end to it. In fact, 3 presidents counting were withdrawing American forces. And at some point, our continued physical presence in Afghanistan was not going to be sustainable. The previous president made that very clear. And Biden brought it to a conclusion. The way we left was terrible. We didn't have to appear to be so shambolic. And in fact, we appeared, what you worry about, the signal of confusion and incapacity of the United States, is a matter of deeply troubling to you as it is to me. But I'm going to try to leave you with a final thought for your discussion on Afghanistan. We are really wrong as a nation if we conclude it's over in Afghanistan. It is not over. The road ahead is long and it's complicated and it requires American engagement. We have to worry about those left behind, be they American citizens or Afghans to whom we owe a special debt of honor as we discharged in the evacuation over a decade long from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. We still have a human dimension. We have a human dimension. There are thousands of people coming across the borders into Pakistan, not sustainable. But some of those are people we have a responsibility for, and we need to adjust our procedures and our rules governing immigration to accommodate those as we accommodated Indo-Chinese in the past. Third, the power question remains. I was astonished when the administration failed to appear at a meeting with Russia, China, Pakistan, Iran, India, to look at the future of Afghanistan, to send coherent signals, for many of us are arguing the same point with the Taliban. Why weren't we present? This is a matter of regional stability, and the United States doesn't have to be at the head of that table, but to be absent from it is, in my judgment, an error.
Time for one final comment, Ambassador Hughes.
Thanks. Frank, two things quickly. North Korea has been crowded off the headlines lately by some of China's more aggressive or read as aggressive moves. What do you think is the right approach for the Biden administration to North Korea, considering the efforts of 4 previous administrations at denuclearization that have pursued all kinds of different avenues, including President Trump's, to so far, well, no conspicuous success? And secondly, to your comment about the TPP, how conceivably could we get back to the TPP in your view?
I'm sorry, I missed the second.
How conceivably can we get back to the TPP as you recommended?
Right. Okay, first on North Korea, I maintain a view that I've expressed in this forum in the past, and that is the pursuit of the denuclearization of North Korea is a futile pursuit. That doesn't mean that at some point in history, we shouldn't be aiming to have a denuclearized Korea. But what we are really aiming for is to remove the danger of a Korea that is nuclearized before it concludes that it doesn't need a nuclear capability in order to defend itself. And that means very carefully entering into agreements that Trump started, I thought, and then dropped the ball at Singapore, of reaching out to the North Koreans and setting limited goals that would lead over time to a peace agreement between the North and the South and ourselves, setting aside the Korean War, of limited cooperation in return for limited reductions in nuclear capability. Instead of saying we're going to denuclearize, we will aim to get there over time, and they can sit on their ice keg and say we're going to keep our nukes, but the reducing the capability and setting a different round or different approach to cooperation strikes me as a better way to go about it. And we've now got ourselves so tied around denuclearization that literally 4 presidents have found their hands tied in conducting what I think is a chance of more effective diplomacy with North Korea. As to your second question, Tim, remind me quickly what that was.
How, given that we did not pursue the Trans-Pacific
Yes.
Partnership,
Well,
is there a way to which we could return to
right.
it?
Sorry, I should have picked it up because I think you're onto something that's very important. I do not see domestic circumstances today permitting this or any other administration to walk back into the successor organization to TPP that the Asians have launched. Certainly not in one big step. And that I think what we're going to see the administration move towards, and we'll have to wish it well and test it based on the reality of what they see, is a series of partial trade engagements dealing with specific trade questions like intellectual property rights, specific areas of enhanced trade, to create an atmosphere of American cooperation with the Indo-Pacific in the trade field without going for the whole, to use that cheap expression, the whole enchilada. I wish we could. We made a mistake in leaving it, but the politics of the United States don't permit us to get back with one big leap. Perhaps small bites are the better approach.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Wisner, for this wonderful tour d'horizon this morning. We missed having that last year. 2 years ago was the last time we were with you, I think, at the Century Club. We thank you very much for your time and extensive effort this morning.
Because that's a very important part of why we have a Council of American Ambassadors. The personal interchange and social interaction and fellowship that we enjoy from our ambassadorial experiences. Thanks for coming. Hope it was successful. We look forward to seeing you at future council programs and at the spring conference.
Thanks, everybody.